Hi, folks. I think now the room's filled up a bit, we'll get going. So welcome everybody to our semi-plenary, which is entitled Joining the Fray, Researcher Engagement with the Practical World of Sustainability Transitions. And I hope you'll find that the session isn't mislabeled. That's exactly what we're going to be looking at. And we're going to, essentially what we're going to be doing is having three different presentations of three practical experiences from three researchers of engagement with sustainability transitions that are happening on the ground, and the ways in which researchers can participate in a much more interactive way than perhaps is traditional with these processes. And so really what we want to be looking at is how researchers have engaged in co-construction of transformative processes with different coalitions or configurations of societal stakeholders. And we have three scholars to talk today. Myself, I'm James Middlecroft. I'm at Carleton University in Ottawa in the School of Public Policy, and I work basically on climate change, the journey to net zero, and energy policy in the Canadian context. And then we have two other distinguished researchers, Sarah Birch at the University of Waterloo, who's going to be talking about a project, Transform, that she's been involved in. And then Katlinka Wijsman, who's at Utrecht University, who's going to be talking about her experiences as well. So the way we thought that we would organize this is basically we'll each give you a presentation of maybe 15 minutes on, on the practical experience, and then we'll have, an exchange back and forth, a discussion around these issues. Apologies that two of the presenters today are online. We were originally thinking that there'd be two of us here, Sarah and myself, and one online, but unfortunately, Sarah had various problems that mean that she cannot actually join us today, even though it's in a way her conference because she's part of the organizing committee and so on. But thanks to the miracle of Zoom, I think you will get, a lot of the content, even if you can't have the physical bodies here with you today. And the sorts of questions that, maybe you want to have in mind while we're going through this is, what are the most fruitful ways in which researchers can get involved with these practical sustainability transitions, which we know are so important in the modern world? What are the problems, the costs, the difficulties to navigate, the pitfalls? The presentations may not directly go on this, though I think you'll find some examples come up, but these are the kinds of things that we want to dig into a bit. And I think I could say that there's an implicit, maybe not explicit, but implicit hidden agenda that we are perhaps trying to encourage more researchers to move out of the academy and move beyond, say, some of the traditional forms. I mean, the traditional forms I'll caricaturize a bit, but is you get a big research project, and then you do interviews, and you do all sorts of investigation, you produce the result, and then you say, right, how are we going to do knowledge communication under the research, the research that we found? How are we going to get this out the door of the university into society? But I think the examples that we're going to be looking at today kind of start from a different point, and it's really about how do we co-research with societal partners? How do we develop with them a transformative trajectory where research feeds into the process, but research isn't necessarily the final end of the process? So that's all I really wanted to say to get us going. And Sarah has kindly agreed to go up first. So if you'll just excuse me, I'll fiddle with the Zoom and hope I don't mug it up too much. Just a sec.
Great.
You should be able to set
Okay.
the screen now, Sarah.
Yeah, I think we're all set. Thanks everyone for being here today. To be clear, there was one very specific problem that inhibited my being there in person, and I managed to dodge COVID for 2.5 years, only to test positive on Tuesday. So that's more than a little heartbreaking, I have to say, after working with Stephen Bernstein and Matt Hoffman for the last year to develop this conference for you. So I'm so glad that I'm more or less vertical, and I'm happy to still come into you today to be a part of this semi-plenary. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get rolling here. All right. So sorry, I'm just going to move my faces here. So as James mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo. I'm also the executive director of the Waterloo Climate Institute, which is an institute that cuts across all of the faculties on campus, from engineering and math and science to arts and environment and health, to bring together climate change researchers of all types and work on collaborative research projects. Both very exploratory in nature as well as applied. This topic is very near and dear to my heart. It's transdisciplinary scholarship. That scholarship that takes a societal outcome or benefit as one of its dominant motivations and co-creates the work right from the beginning, from problem definition on through to the end, with partners and collaborators in mind, has been the sort of most familiar and challenging and exciting mode of research that I've participated in over the last many years. And I'm actually going to talk about one in more detail, but two activities that I've been a part of over the last several years that I think shed a little bit of light, at least on my experience and that of my team, on how transdisciplinary sustainability scholarship can unfold. So that is the Transform project. I've been the project director since its inception. The grant was awarded in 2018 and launched in 2019. So it's been going for a little while, but something rather major happened in the world in 2020. So there were a couple of years of interesting bumps and swerves along the way. And so I'll be talking a bit about our process and some of our results and some reflections. And then move on very briefly just to an interesting experience that I've had over the last year, working with the federal government of Canada to develop Canada's first national climate change adaptation strategy. And that's to be launched at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few weeks. So that's been enlightening in all kinds of ways and challenging and fascinating for me. So I'm going to share some of my reflections on that. But I'd like to zoom out at the end and offer some thoughts on what qualities of researchers, of scholars and scholarship we might look to cultivate so that we can do a better job of joining the fray, of moving out from our home institutions and our comfort zones and be a part of the world, and kind of explore and reflect on our evolving roles. Not to say that we should all have the same role, because certainly we all have different skills, but I think the ground is shifting, especially when it comes to issues that are of such significant societal impact, like sustainability and climate change. So getting to the Transform project. So as I mentioned, this benefited from a large Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant and began in 2019. And this is a partnership-based research project. So the whole essence of the project was to build partnerships, both among different scholars around the world. We have hubs in Leuphana, in Germany, in Lund, in the United States, at Arizona State, at Monash University in Australia and elsewhere. A whole collaborative team of interdisciplinary sustainability scholars, but also partnerships between civil society organizations and various levels of government, the goal of which is to understand what small and medium-sized enterprises might do to transform their business models, their practices, and their operations towards a more sustainable development pathway. But then also to get right in the mess and build capacity, collaboratively build capacity among those firms to undertake new sustainability experiments and then support and understand those experiments as they unfold. So this is kind of the essence of the Transform project as a whole. Dr. Chris Orr, maybe in the audience there, who's an excellent postdoctoral research fellow who's been working with Transform for the last year. Jose DiBella has been central to this, Arnhem Week, Megan Fairley, Wendy Stubbs, Daniel Lang, Barry Ness, a whole slew of excellent folks. So the main sets of activities were focused on this knowledge synthesis process where we were studying emerging transformative sustainability practices and business models so that we could develop tools and resources for researchers and policymakers to scale up and replicate what they're doing. We are still developing policy guidance for governments at multiple levels to support small businesses who we view are these key actors in urban sustainability transformations. We are co-creating capacity building processes, mostly in partnership with civil society partners like sustainable business networks that work directly with small businesses to help them engage in sustainability. And then we're also working with small businesses to design and test and explore transformative sustainability experiments. So all of this is really the result of partnerships across sectors and across disciplines and has been really exciting work. We're looking across the kind of sustainability spectrum. So we're looking at construction waste diversion and circularity. We're looking at practices that focus on energy transitions and zero carbon operations. We're talking about employee well-being and community support. So we're viewing sustainability not just as a narrow set of technical criteria, but also really taking social and economic sustainability very seriously in this work. So the process that we followed, at least in the first couple of years of this project, we're now moving into the capacity building and experimentation phases. But the process that we followed is what I would view to be a deeply transdisciplinary research methodology. So we worked with civil society partners and small businesses to co-develop our research questions. We had our own, things that kept us up at night and the things that we thought were exciting, but we wanted to understand what they thought was exciting and problematic and important for us to support them on. So we developed the research questions with them, also the sampling methodology, which firms are we working with, what questions are we asking in our interviews and our focus groups, and working with them on this sort of iterative, ongoing relationship building and validation process that kind of unfolded over a couple of years. We identified and invited the SMEs that we've now been working with for a couple of years to participate in the research itself and to map the sustainability practices that they had undertaken, both some that had fallen off and not succeeded, but others that had unfolded and grown over time. We carried out a series of interviews with folks in the organization, as well as increasingly organizations that support that firm. So as we moved through this process, we came to a deeper appreciation of just how interconnected different actors are when it comes to these transformative processes, that it isn't actually helpful to look only at a small business in isolation, but rather to start thinking of it as part of an ecosystem. And it is that ecosystem that transforms and shifts. So we started carrying out more interviews in the with civil society actors, competing or complementary firms, and this kind of thing to understand the whole ecosystem. We mapped that ecosystem through a visual process that I'll show you in a sec. We developed a series of sequences to understand how a practice kind of came up, when the experimentation happened, how it was implemented and monitored and then spread or shared, and who was involved at each stage. And those sequences have helped us to kind of understand the lifespan of a sustainability practice. And then now we're in a process of convening sort of wider groups of actors to in this case, it's not, as James said, to just kind of communicate our findings. It's actually to mobilize them, to peel back the layers together, to ask our partners and these civil society actors or whoever to envision what a transformed and more deeply sustainable ecosystem of small businesses would look like, and then to articulate where in that future, what actions they themselves have control over to actually kind of mobilize action in the future. Just very briefly, that iterative process has led to 65, 70 cases now, small business cases, each with a pathway that looks like this. I don't need you to read the fine text, just to show that we are kind of unfolding this sequence of activities and identifying the blue bubbles there, which are those ecosystem actors that influence the success with which a transformative, sustainability-oriented practice unfolds. These are all actually just going live on our website this week, from Melbourne, from here in Canada, from Colombia, from Sweden and Germany, and all of our hubs. We're really excited to bring this work back to the businesses we've been working with all along. It's shed some light on interesting benefits of transformative change through the eyes of a small business rather than just through our own eyes as researchers, both at the organizational level within the firm, but also at a sort of more system level, ranging from reducing our operating costs, which is of course what we always immediately think about, but also risk exposure, branding, employee retention, which is increasingly important during and post-pandemic. We're hearing from employers a lot more that that especially younger people are sort of demanding that the companies they work with and the organizations they work for reflect their values. And enhanced innovation, various other bits. So we're getting a lens into transformative change at the ecosystem level that I don't think we would have had we not engaged so deeply with the firms from the beginning. And just a couple of lessons here before I move on to the second example of the National Adaptation Strategy. Ultimately, we're coming out of this, or in the midpoint, I guess, of this. We have a few more years left. And we are observing again and again that these transformative processes are deeply political, they're deeply social. Even the ones that seem to be technical are actually social at their origin, which technologies are deployed and chosen and how they unfold. The social dimensions of sustainability transformations are absolutely front and center. We're also increasingly viewing them as collective processes rather than individual processes happening within one firm. It's the interstices and the connections between actors that matter so much. Again and again, I mean, we started this work in 2019. It really got rolling in 2020, only to get walloped by the pandemic. And you can imagine, some of you may work for or with or own small businesses, and it's been a really hard couple of years for small businesses. So taking seriously the trade-offs between the potential trade-offs, which aren't always realized, but the potential or perceived trade-offs between sustainability, especially transformative approaches, and business viability and profit are really important. And we all learned, I think, again and again, that scholars can participate actively in these transformations. And in fact, I would say that by stepping back from the societal processes, the politics, the demands of practitioners, and trying to privilege, objectivity over engagement and compassion, we are participating, just not in a particularly positive way. So that has been our experience with Transform. I'd like to turn the page now and speak very briefly about this very policy-oriented process that I've been engaged in the last year, because it helps me get to my final point about values. So Canada has been working for the last year to develop its first national adaptation strategy. This is the process that you see in front of you, and it's to be launched at COP27. The initial stages of the process were convening a series of advisory tables, which is not, earth-shatteringly novel. But these are the 5 that were convened: health and well-being, resilient natural and built infrastructure, thriving natural environment, strong and resilient economy, and disaster resilience and security. Each of these advisory tables were co-chaired by one person from government and one person outside of government. And so I was co-chairing number 4, the strong and resilient economy, despite not at all, even a little, being an economist, but my co-chair was from Environment and Climate Change Canada and Natural Resources Canada. So this convened 20 or so folks throughout in each of these tables. In our case, these were leaders from the various sectors. So we had people from forestry, ports, mines, insurance, finance, etc. And the goals were to develop aspirational or transformative goals for what a resilient, adaptable Canada might look like in 2050. And then to work backwards, you might recognize this as a backcasting process, to medium-term objectives, and then consult on some specific and near-term actions. And I bring this up because it was an enormous, and this is not meant to be self-serving in any way, but it was an enormous investment of my time over the year, and time away from teaching and research. And it wasn't time that was granted to me, but it was time that I gave. But it was such an interesting opportunity to watch policymaking and consultation unfold in real life. And what I saw was a lot of what we talk about in our scholarship around the multi-level governance of climate change and sustainability. I saw different worldviews and discourses kind of colliding to define the problems we're actually trying to solve very differently. And one example was we were arguing about just sort of the essence of adaptation and what has to happen. And one person was arguing, we know what the problem is. We absolutely know what the problem is. Climate change impacts are accelerating. We haven't been investing enough in infrastructure, which sounds fair enough. But then another person said, what if that's not the problem? What if the problem is poverty? And so, this kind of thing happened all the time, where there were completely different definitions of what the core problem is that we're trying to solve, and then who's responsible for solving it, at what level of government, who needs to be involved. And as the process wrapped up and media started floating to the surface, the odd article here and there in international newspapers about the National Adaptation Strategy, a lot of that was fairly critical, in part because there hasn't been a lot of detail released yet. It hasn't fully been announced till COP27. And I was approached, this is sort of a personal anecdote, but I was approached by a couple of colleagues, just one or two, who said, they were afraid that this national adaptation strategy was really deeply flawed and unambitious, and we should get together, just a couple of us, and develop what we think are the best adaptation policy pathways for the country. And I thought, that's so fascinating, because we've just rounded out a year-long, very rich, diverse, contested process, getting together folks from all different backgrounds to try and hash this out. And it just reminded me of a core value that I think we should cultivate when it comes to this work, which is humility. But there are a lot of other values, and I'm just going to end by talking about those very briefly. I know I'm about a minute or two over time already. So first, I would just start with the values of scholarship that we have traditionally tended to train earlier career researchers to do, or at least how we frame the value of our work. And that is that objectivity is crucial. It's our core contribution to the world. We focus on novelty. We always have to argue what's new, what's novel about what we're doing. We need accuracy, we need rigor. It tends to be really good if you can define what you own or what your contribution, so that you can get credit for it, whether it's citations or promotion or whatever. And speed. And I would say quantity in a lot of ways as well. Quantity of papers, speed of publication, and that objectivity and rigor. In the work that I've done and that I've seen in others, these are closer to the values that I would see supporting transdisciplinary sustainability science, which would be, in my view, humility, because we're always cutting across disciplines and working with folks whose lived experiences we don't know, and in disciplines or sectors that we haven't ourselves been a part of. Attentiveness and reflexivity, so that we can question our own assumptions and really listen. Imagination. We've seen lots of great examples of how to cultivate imagination already at this conference this weekend, whether that's visualization or art or music. I saw many of you have seen perhaps on Twitter, Joost Vervoort singing a quote by Flora Avellino, who does great work on power and sustainability transitions, but singing it in a death metal voice, which I really loved. trust, and diversity. So I would just like us all maybe to hold up these sets of qualities. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, and I don't think that they're necessarily in tension with each other. But we do have to reflect on what qualities we're cultivating in our work. And all this to conclude that I think we're in the midst of an evolution of the role of a researcher in sustainability science. A couple of weeks ago, I was reading a really great book by Atul Gawande, who is a physician. It's called Being Mortal. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but it talks about end-of-life care, essentially, and what it means to age and die, and what we're looking for in physicians, in particular in healthcare. And he was describing this evolution of the role of a physician from a paternalistic role where they the doctor's role is to know what's good for you, to be inviolable, a source of authority, always right, and choosing what information you need, and then giving you that information. And that has evolved to a more informative technician role for the physician where, okay, so I won't tell you what's good for you, but I'll give you all the data, and it's up to you to decide. And I step back and present that to you. But what is actually needed is an interpretive role for a physician, especially at end of life, a counselor, somebody who has a grasp of the data and the science and is an expert, but also listens to the communities they're working in and for to align those facts with our priorities as a community and what we value. And I wonder, this leaves me, with the feeling that those who study climate change and sustainability crises are being called to a similar role, or at least progression, that it's not enough to just present the data, the dire consequences, the truth telling of what's going on in the world. And it's certainly not appropriate to prescribe solutions without understanding the lived experiences of those who bear the consequences of those solutions. So we are, we're seeing this in the conference, and I think what I'm hoping we'll arrive at is the observation that our job as Earth system governance scholars, as sustainability scientists, isn't just to prolong survival at all costs. That's not actually our goal. Our goal is to listen when people tell us what well-being is and enable that through our work. So with that, I would thank you for your attention. I really look forward to questions, and I will pass it back to James.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, for a wonderful talk. So we'll now kind of keep going and have the second one that will be slightly different take on it. So I'm just going to find out where the stop sharing button has disappeared to. Oops, not that obviously. How do I get it? Yeah, but it's under the. Yeah, but no, it goes to there. You see the button is under touch screen to return. Sorry, folks, it's the button we need to push to share screen is under another button, which sends us somewhere else. What if we push escape? Hello? Yeah, it's working on Zoom. The share screen button is under a touch. Sorry, folks. Okay, sorry, folks. Yeah. Okay, so the next one up is me, and I'm going to talk about an experience with an organization called the Transition Accelerator, which was set up a couple of years ago. I guess you could call it an NGO. It's a pan-Canadian organization that works on accelerating, particularly the transition to net zero. So the focus is really around the climate change file. And this is the outline what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to briefly introduce you to this organization, the Transition Accelerator, describe its basic approach, and then give a couple of practical examples of the kind of work that this organization does. And then, as Sarah did, but perhaps less eloquently, discuss some of the challenges and issues for reflection. So this did not start, whereas Sarah's starting point was basically a research project that was international, that was a partnership, development, so on. We're starting here with a different point, which is the creation of an organization that's outside the university sphere, though it involves researchers and research input to the work that this organization is doing. So it's a national not-for-profit that works with groups to define and build out net zero transition pathways. It links climate to other system problems. So part of its kind of underlying philosophy is that you can't address the climate problem separately from change that's happening within these broader systems. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. The key kind of focus, so we're starting, Sarah's work originally from firms and worked outwards into the ecosystem. In a way, we're starting from the other end. We're starting from the key production consumption systems, or the key socio-technical systems, if you use that language, that are involved with the climate change problem. And so that includes electricity systems, transport, buildings, and so on. And there are two kinds of activities that this organization engages in. One is what we call pathway development, which is actually working with stakeholders on the ground in a particular town or region involved in a sector to work with them to define what would a transformation look like in your particular context. And the other is there's some kind of more traditional, you could call it knowledge mobilization activities, where we've done things like developing courses that are for business or civil servants around what is net zero and what's the challenge, some of the challenges involved in getting to net zero and so on. And that didn't go anywhere. Okay, so the basic kind of underlying approach or theory of change that this organization used is actually derived from the field of transition studies. So some of you may have come in contact with this literature, which is basically starts with a historical backlook and says, if we look at the evolution of human production consumption systems over the past 150, 200 years, what we see is that there have been a whole series of major changes that have taken place. So it starts from systems And in this case, we're thinking about socio-technical systems. So the electricity system is a good example. It's a system that is both technical. So look, it's a connection of wires and transformers and power stations that you plug your device into on one hand, but it's also a social system. It involves property relations. It involves regulation, rules about who can connect to the grid and who can't connect to the grid. Regulatory bodies, power market, electricity markets, and all those things are social relations. And if you want to understand what's going on in electricity, you need to understand how those two things are completely interconnected and interwoven. So if we look at how those systems develop, those kinds of systems, you can think about in agriculture or the built environment or transport, how they change over time. Most change is incremental. That's to say their adjustment to particular societal practices or technologies. Think about the Model T Ford, which is, you know, more than 100 years ago, and a modern internal combustion engine. They are recognizably the same thing. Though in another sense, they're completely different. The modern car has power brakes and windshield wipers and home entertainment systems and supercharging and all sorts of stuff. But it's basically an internal engine, combustion engine automobile with four wheels running on gasoline. And most change in our system, but occasionally systems go through more radical change. So think about moving from a transport system based on horses and carriages to one based on the automobile, or moving, or digitalization of society, or moving from you know, standpipes and outhouses to piped water and modern sewage systems and so on. So if you back off from that and think about climate change and what it takes to get to net zero, you will see that we need a whole series of these transformations in a number of different systems. So we need transformation in the agri-food system. We need transformation in the way we move people, move goods, and so on. So basically, what sustainability transition studies does is look at some of the lessons from these transitions and say, how do we apply them in the context of climate change? And I won't take up the time now to go through these, but there's some, you know, in any detail, but there's some really big ones that stand out. So I guess I guess the ones that, you know, really stand out is if we're thinking about systems and regions, which in Canada are really important, because what's going to happen in different systems is, so what we need in agri-food is not what we need in light duty transport, and what we need in Alberta is not exactly what we need in Quebec, and so on. So think in terms of regions and systems is very important, but also the processes of change in those systems are not just being driven by climate change. There's all sorts of other interesting stuff that matter to people that are going on to in those systems, besides a concern with moving towards net zero. Just think about automobile transport, for instance. We've got things like, you know, new models of ownership. We've got Uber and Lyft. We've got young people being less interested in cars than they're a couple of generations back. We've got autonomous vehicles hovering on the future. All sorts of stuff are shaking up this sector, besides the fact that we have to stop using gasoline in cars and so on. So if we're approaching transformation in these sectors, we need to think about that. And I guess I would say the other thing I would really add that's important is if you're thinking in terms of system change, that's to say switching our transport system so it moves towards net zero, then talking about GHG tons and incremental change is just not really going to get you there. The focus, the critical thing for action or movement is what pushes you towards a system that would be both better and also net zero. So one of the things that the accelerator works on is pathways, which is up on the slide here, which basically to develop pathways, you need a conception of a desirable future. You need some sort of detailed understanding of where we are today, and then steps that can join the two. And and pathway development, which is what we do with stakeholders in a particular sector or region, very much involves the development of transformative narratives that are grounded in data and analysis and shared aspirations that then you can actually build out in practice. And I'm really just giving you, so this is kind of the methodology that the accelerator works with when we're actually working with groups on the ground. And it's kind of 4 stages, which in a sense are a co-development or a transdisciplinary process that we start by. I don't mean academics start by in the lab or in their office developing an understanding of the system. I mean, working with stakeholders in the system. We develop an understanding of, I don't know, how did the road network, how did transport develop in the city of Toronto over the past 50 years or whatever. Looking at how a particular system works, its strengths and weaknesses, compelling drivers of change, and then move to co-develop pathways and then test them, model them, explore them with further groups of stakeholders. And then if the process works, and it can be a process that can take, several years, not several months, then the stakeholders that you've been working with will be willing to invest, put out money, do other things to actually develop experiments and pilots and so on. And all of this in an iterative way that links researchers and the stakeholders. So these are 3 kind of practical examples that we've been involved with over the past couple of years, and each of them involved this sort of process and engagement and pathway building, but they also resulted in the creation of actual organizations with their own business plans and so on. So when I say this group is called the Transition Accelerator, it's like a business accelerator. Our aim is to work with people in an area or sector, give rise to organizations that will drive the change, and then it's their ball and they'll run with it, and we will stay engaged if we can be helpful, but there are plenty of other places for us to work. So the first place that we did with this really, I'm policing myself. The first place that we did this was around hydrogen, which we started out working with truckers in Alberta. They were not happy with diesel. They hate their industry because it's filthy. And young people aren't going to it. They would love to electrify some way, but batteries don't work. They're just the trucks. This is the really big ones, the tandem trucks and so on. Fuel cells work. I won't go into why, but that led to engagement around hydrogen as a zero carbon fuel, which then fed wider into the economy of Alberta and various projects and so on. And ultimately that led to the creation of the Edmonton Hydrogen Hub, which has finance from all 3 levels of government and is actually, developing stuff on the ground. I just want to make it clear, we are not an organization that kind of supports tech because we think this technology is the answer to everything. What we support is disruptive and transformative change in the sector that can lead to more inspiring visions of the future. Accelerate is another organization that we spawned. So what is this? This is this zero supply chain organization for zero emission vehicles in Canada. So this is people who manufacture batteries, electric charging stations, electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells. So we actually worked with the mining industry. We worked with all these people basically to build a supply chain organization that advocates for, for support for building out these supply chains in Canada. Why? Well, you could say, oh, well, that's just a business organization or something like that. That's not reducing emissions. But the fact is, if we want to accelerate decarbonization in the transport sector, we need to also to be building Canadian industry and expertise in this area, and not just kind of shut up Oshawa and so on, because we're only going to make SUVs and things like that. And this organization now has something like 60 or more companies in it, and it's working with the government and so on. And we're actually just one more example, we're in the process of setting up the Building Electrification Alliance that will work with stakeholders across the building chain, from construction industry to architects, in order to get gas out of Canadian homes, basically. So these are just a couple of practical examples. I'll skip over this very quickly, but this is a report we did about a year and a half ago on pathways in Canada. So this report was more technically focused if you wanted, but I don't expect you to read this, but we have many of these assessment tables of different kinds of options. And just to show, we were evaluating battery electric and mixed ethanol with gasoline solutions. You won't be surprised to see that the mixed ethanol with gasoline ends up with a red flag at the far end. But I'd like to direct your attention that the principal emission reductions in Ontario's existing climate plan are envisaged to be by upping the amount of ethanol and gasoline sold in Ontario by 2030. And I'll skip this. These are postage stamps of different sectors. And just a couple of issues for reflection and so on. Challenges that we've found are integrating more researchers. So the skills that this kind of work uses is not necessarily the ones that we train our researchers for, because it's interacting with people on the ground, from businesses, from government, from municipalities, discussing their problems. Lots of people will give you money for projects. They're less interested in funding kind of core activities and training, recruiting, training, and staff. This would sound funny, but right now, there's a huge demand in Canada for people with knowledge in the net zero space. For those of you working on your PhDs and so on, that's maybe encouraging, but suddenly oil companies and banks and others have realized that, oh, maybe this is getting serious, and they hire people away. We've had our hydrogen people hired away. They start with double the salary the first day they work for a business company. How do you combine a strategic vision with opportunism? Somebody says, oh, we'll fund you this to do this. So the government says, oh, we'll give you 60,000 if you'll just do that. How do you not fall into just churning that kind of stuff? And the changing political climate, we're already thinking about how would our activities have to be adjusted in the context of Poilievre government or a radical change in Canadian government. So my list for reflection touches the ones that Sarah did. She, I think, got at some of them. So finding a role that suits your skills and your interests, if you're interested in engaging in these kinds of works. The ethics of research and intervention. How do you, at what point do you, suggest that we should be doing this, or how, and how do you mediate that relationship with stakeholders? And for you as researchers, what part does these kinds of activities take in your career progress, which is probably particularly harder for younger researchers or those who haven't finished their PhD or those still seeking tenure, if these sorts of activities are not valorized and so on. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to the next speaker.
Yes. Can you see my screen all right?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh yeah, we're all right. You should be okay.
Yeah, okay. I can tell what's up or not. Thank you for having me. And unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person, but I appreciate that we make this happen digitally. And it's very exciting for me to speak in a panel alongside James and Sarah. My name is Katinka Wijsman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And today I'll be talking about a multi-year transdisciplinary project that I was involved in as a research associate while I was still in the politics department at the New School in New York City. And I was part of a researcher practitioner network alongside natural and social scientists, policymakers, landscape architects, regulatory staff, community representatives, engineers, and people from non-governmental organizations who jointly worked on creating a monitoring framework to assess the quote unquote performance of shoreline features. And this project took place in New York State and broadly speaking addressed this question of the planning of shoreline resilience. And on my slide, you see a rendering created by the architectural firm OMA, which I think captures the overall challenge in a compelling and sort of provocative way. What should our shorelines look like in the future, materially and socially, given detrimental consequences of climate change? Like, what kinds of shoreline sustainability transitions are possible? What kinds are desirable? Or to put in more policy and planning oriented language, how should we design or manage our shorelines? So over the next few slides, I'll first talk you through some of the details of this project before also offering some reflections on transdisciplinary work and the need to question what our academics' roles enable and also constrain us to do in the work of sustainability transitions. So next week, it will be a decade ago that Superstorm Sandy made landfall and wreaked havoc in New York State, and in particular in the regions of New York City and Long Island. And immediately after this storm, there was this enormous uptake in climate resilience activities in all sorts of sectors and government agencies, with one of the main driving questions being how to prevent dystopian images like the one shown on this slide from becoming an actuality. And governance responses ranged from proposals for managed retreats to the construction of storm surge barriers, and in many places, the already ongoing project of shoreline armoring, which is the term used for hardening the shoreline by adding features like seawalls or bulkheads, was taken up a notch. Yet the call for natural and nature-based solutions as an alternative to intervention also grew louder. And these nature-based solutions could potentially counter some of the negative consequences associated with shoreline hardening, such as exacerbated erosion, habitat degradation, diminishing access to water bodies, while also providing protection from rising waters and other social and ecological benefits for dwellers on and near the shoreline. So yet, despite this growing interest in nature-based shoreline features, which is expressed through, for example, an increasing number of pilot projects, but also recent programs, plans, and even laws that explicitly support the implementation of nature-based solutions, their widespread adoption in New York State remains limited. And one of the barriers to their implementation is a perceived lack of evidence for their functioning in comparison to these more conventional solutions, combined with an inability for design, policy, and also assessment procedures to kind of capture these benefits of these solutions. And the permitting process in particular has appeared to be a bottleneck, with engineers that are accustomed to assessing applications for hard infrastructural features not focused on evaluating ecological value or nor convinced of the need to consider social impact at all. So this project was born with the aim of informing decision-making around shoreline management. And core of the project was to develop a monitoring framework for shoreline features in New York State to facilitate this comparison of natural and nature-based features with conventional shoreline approaches. And the project was thus a kind of an attempt to operationalize resilience in the context of shoreline management. Resilience having become this sort of guiding motif for post-Sandy planning, and also focus on finding ways to measure resilience. And so in this multi-stage co-creative effort, it involved 155 individuals working across sectors and across the state, Key indicators were identified and standardized protocols were created to generate this comparable data across shorelines in the state with the ultimate aim to facilitate a way of valuing shorelines beyond their ability to be some kind of static border between water and land. And with the next slides, I'll discuss some of the key elements of this process. A starting point for this process was the misrecognition of ecological and social benefits as provided by natural and nature-based features in comparison to these hard infrastructures. Put differently, often shoreline resilience is seen as a matter of structural integrity alone, even though resilience obviously can take on different meanings. So during the first phase, an interdisciplinary and multi-sector core team developed the goals and the basic structure of the monitoring framework and addressed this question of how to approach resilience, asking what are the services and functions that need to be maintained or recovered for shoreline to be considered resilience. While there was broad agreement that a specific answer to this question is time and place specific, it was also agreed that 3 broad categories can be used to kickstart such discussions. And the first category is ecological function, referring to the potential of a shoreline feature to enhance biodiversity or to create biological function or restore environmental processes. The second category is hazard mitigation and structural integrity, which really refers to this ability of a shoreline feature to resist breaking or deforming under various pressures like superstorms, and reducing and eliminating risk to life and property from such hazardous events. And then the third category consists of social and economic outcomes, which includes direct and indirect effects of shoreline features on people and their livelihoods. And these 3 categories together were termed resilience services to really center resilience as a goal in shoreline planning, while also allowing for the inclusion of benefits and burdens rooted in ecological, technological, and social domains simultaneously. So during the second phase, the core team convened so-called technical working groups around each of these 3 resilience services to develop a draft monitoring framework with preliminary indicators and protocols for shoreline monitoring. And these groups consisted of 10 to 15 members each, and they represented a mixture of expertise areas and experience from the private sector, public agencies, academia. And through a number of in-person and online meetings that included structured brainstorming exercises, voting exercises, in-depth discussion, these indicators were identified and then prioritized, and then monitoring protocols were outlined. And the input from these groups were then consolidated by the core team, resulting in this draft monitoring framework, which was meant to be applicable to the full range of shoreline features across this green to gray spectrum. And then this draft framework was taken on the road and subjected to lots of critique and new input in a series of in-person and online workshops that engaged different audiences. Audiences that included experts on shoreline management through a project advisory committee, but also practitioners from 4 regions in New York State in regional working groups, and also regulatory staff across the state in permit reviewers meetings. And each of these meetings was organized around various rounds of collecting feedback and input on this draft framework, really soliciting a reaction on the proposed indicators and protocols in particular through plenary discussions, small breakout groups, voting exercises. And then jointly, these groups sort of prioritized the list of indicators and protocols, and they pointed out crucial emissions as well, with the goal to facilitate the most relevant and feasible possible way to monitor New York State shorelines. And so by the middle of the third phase, the framework had grown to over 80 indicators and over 60 potential protocols. So in the subsequent stage, the technical working groups narrowed this down to 19 indicators and 17 protocols based on a combination of the expertise that they represented, but also this feedback and input that was provided by these other 3 groups, really trying to balance the request for modifications with a measure of scientific rigor and relevancy to management. And this slide shows the content of the framework as it was settled on in this fourth phase. And then in the final phase, the monitoring framework was tested to see whether both the desktop as well as the field-based protocols were user-friendly, whether they were complete, clear in their application. And this testing happened across the different regions of the state and included different types of shoreline features, ranging from these hard gray infrastructures to hybrid ones to natural ones. And then this phase offered some concrete suggestions to make measurement easier to execute. So by the beginning of 2020, a final report was released with the monitoring framework alongside measurement protocols and worksheets available for downloading at the website of DOS. The link on the screen is still active, so you can find the materials there. And while as a group, we were lucky enough to wrap this project up pre-COVID, the pandemic has really impacted the rollout of the monitoring effort. But earlier this year, a follow-up project proposal was submitted for funding. And if this gets awarded, the project will be sort of revamped in a part 2 with the goal to really formalize a community of practice around natural and nature-based shoreline features in New York State and beyond. So now I'd like to just take a few minutes to offer some reflections on the project and its collaborations and why participating in these kinds of efforts as scholars interested in sustainability transitions is a worthwhile endeavor. And I'd like to preface these comments by saying that for me personally, participating in this project was a little bit of a wild ride. I initially joined the team as a participant observer. My dissertation work was on resilience imaginaries in coastal places and the politics of belonging that they generate. And I was interested in following the group to study this. And I came in with a somewhat skeptical and critical attitude. For example, I was wary of the discourse of resilience and its speedy uptake and the ways its sort of common senseness can lead to depoliticization. And I was also less than pleased with the government agency having a foundational role in conceptualizing and executing this project. Yet I also saw the value of thinking about concrete solutions to issues of climate change and the necessity of partnering with those in power. And over the months that I was part of this project, I found that colleagues, with which I mean academics in more applied fields than my own, but also the practitioners involved in this project, were frequently open to different perspective and challenging conversations about the thing that a sort of critical scholar in me had issues with. And a core group in this team very much sees itself as doing political work, as changing these systems in crucial ways to allow for more sustainable and resilient futures. Okay, so let me outline 3 challenges that came to the fore in this particular project and that might have wider applications for joining the fray, as James had put it, in sustainability transitions work. And the first challenge is to work in an inter and transdisciplinary fashion in a meaningful and thorough way. And clearly here, the framework developed wanted to expand this universe of values and benefits attached to shoreline beyond this commonplace engineering criteria. Yet this integration of natural and social science remained a challenge, not only because of disciplinary silos, which actually were reflected in the organization of these technical working groups, but also because of a sometimes persistent unwillingness or inability to engage with different epistemologies, ontologies, and ethical commitments. And so an assumption that was built into the monitoring framework is that of commensurability. And because of that, it was easy to slip into assumptions of hegemonic positivism and much harder to create a space for interpretive or other approaches about what or how to monitor the resilience of shorelines. And implicit yet presumed hierarchies between research approaches, but also between researchers can then quickly turn into a problem. For example, where social science is seen as an add-on to natural science without implications for the practices of natural science or without impact on the foundational architecture of a project. and also less senior scholars not taken as seriously as their more established counterparts. And in this particular project, this type of issue was dealt with by a number of core team members spending significant time interpreting, translating, communicating across the various groups. And in a reflection on the project, however, this led to a recommendation for future projects to really explicitly dedicate some time and resources to ontological, epistemological, and ethical deliberations. But that's actually something that can be really challenging given the structure of much funding. A second challenge regards this work of co-creation. This type of multi-actor governance is increasingly advocated as a necessary and desirable step to implement natural and nature-based solutions. But this kind of inclusion is not a straightforward process. And in this project, for example, the core team tried to create open and varied ways for participants to express their positions, but it remains difficult to gauge whether people are willing and able to dissent in front of others. Also, there's a resource burden in terms of who or what is able to participate. And in this particular project, there was an overrepresentation of highly educated and white people compared to those who live in the regions. Indigenous communities were a noticeable absence, which was the result of an outreach effort that was not tailored to the demands of relevant, reciprocal, respectful, and responsible relations, but instead worked with a timeline and a mode of communication that's geared towards professional organizations and government agencies. And finally, in the reflection on the project, we noticed this paradox to co-creative work that was especially evident in the dynamics of the core group and the technical working groups, namely that the process is meant to encourage ownership and active participation, yet the presence of others can actually lead to a less active stance. And so dealing with different interpretations of responsibility and taking a role then became an added challenge in the project and a question about both internal dynamics as well as external ones. And a final challenge I want to point out here is dealing with the pragmatism needed for policy relevant research that can be at odds with some of the more academic questions we might want to ask. So for example, the idea of resilience service was super quickly accepted among participants because of its resonance with the language of ecosystem services. But there was no time or space to discuss whether this is even a desirable way to conceptualize nature-society relations. Also, the insistence on the ease to implement a monitoring framework to enable its uptake led to relatively simple low-tech monitoring protocols with consequences for the accuracy of data. So for example, to establish environmental justice communities, a method was picked that was easy to use over an alternative method that could more easily deal with updates in underlying census data. And so these kinds of compromises in this project were necessary and yet sometimes painful. But with the ultimate question for academic practitioners like ourselves being, where's our bottom line? And I found that establishing that bottom line is not only a negative, however, but if you know where you will make concessions, you also know where you can push and not accept compromise. So my personal wins in this project, for example, is that environmental justice was taken as a core concern for the framework, and also for a number of more hardcore natural scientists to write off on this idea that the creation of resilience is a social process in which values are central and subject to change. So ultimately, and this is what I want to leave us with, I think this crucial question to continue to ask is, what roles can we take in these kinds of processes? What hats do we wear? Are we agitators? Are we bridge builders? Are we diplomats? Are we killjoys? Are we translators? What roles are needed and which are we comfortable taking? And personally, I increasingly find myself not taking one specific type of role, but adapting my attitude and role in relation to others. I spend part of my time, for example, working to bring insights from critical social sciences and humanities to colleagues in more applied or natural science-oriented fields. For example, through these kinds of transdisciplinary projects, but also interdisciplinary publishing. And yet in audiences of more critical scholars, I find myself advocating this suspension of judgment, this humility that Sarah talked about, like going beyond a diagnosis of shortcomings to offering openings for alternatives. And so ultimately, our times require more sustained dialogues between critique and pragmatism. And I think it's these kinds of projects that we are talking about in our session today that can be excellent breeding ground for such exchanges. Okay, my final slide, together with some colleagues who wrote up both the process and the content of this framework. So if you're interested in more details or reflections, you can find the paper Open Access in Ecology and Society. And I also quickly wanted to mention an innovative session that's happening tomorrow at 1 p.m. It's on the politics and relationality of knowledge integration that takes up some of the similar issues that we are discussing here today. So if you are not busy yet, please join for that session. Thanks everyone for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions and engaging in dialogue with all of you.
Hello? Yes. Okay. So that one, the battery died. Okay. So who would like to, so you've had 3 different examples of different kinds of projects that attempt to engage with this transdisciplinary pattern of research that brings researchers into contact with societal processes and stakeholders. So really, we want to open it up for discussion and have your comments, observations. Yes, there's someone at the back. So we're down to 1 mic. So
Thanks so much. I'm particularly focused at the moment on nature-based solutions and natural assets and using ecosystem services in communities. And so one of the things that's coming up is as your work becomes more fruitful and there is greater demand and some of our policy barriers are becoming overcome, becomes the question of competencies and capacities to actually deliver those sorts of services. Could you speak a little bit to what it is when you're trying to enact and make practical application of what you're talking about in terms of how we can also move that part of the conversation or that part of the capacity forward?
I think that's a really excellent question and one that's difficult to answer. And maybe especially because I come at this as a political scientist by training and not someone who's trained in ecological thinking so much. But I think, and this is something that we try to do in our project in terms of the monitoring and the way in which the monitoring is done there, we very much took this approach of, okay, if we want this to happen, we need to, yes, hold on to some ambition, but we need to bring it down, make it very concrete, make it very cost effective, for example, make it very easy to execute, like, and just do a ton of that work ourselves as this group. So rather than expecting others to pick it up and to put in a lot of time and effort, we did some of that work for people, I guess, so to say. But yeah, I think I'm sorry, I realize I'm not completely answering your question, and I think it's because it's a really challenging one and something that we need to think about as like a community here. And it relates both to like how we train ourselves, our researchers, our students, et cetera, what the kind of skills are that we want to sort of develop, but also what we recognize in the world as already existing and how we link up to that. Yeah, I'm curious if maybe, Sarah, do you have thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, we've had a lot of these conversations in the Transform project because we intentionally didn't constrain very much, at least, the sort of sustainability challenges or practices we wanted to focus on. So that meant that some firms were doing decarbonization, others were working on their water stuff, others were working on their, inclusive employment and hiring practices and employee co-ownership of, of the firm and profits. So there was such a diversity of technical practices that no one person could possibly know about them all. So we were reflecting often on what are the competencies that we do have that we bring to the table that they might not have, that might be helpful or new or of use. And how do we partner with practitioners, other organizations that do have those various technical competencies. So that led to a couple of decisions. One was in the capacity building part of our project, instead of us, like me personally and Chris Orr, who I think is in the room, and others being the capacity builders, we partnered with a civil society organization that we had a long history of working with that does this day in, day out. They're experts at it. What they hadn't done was thought a lot about transformation. They had been taking a slightly more incremental approach to dealing with climate change and sustainability. So we kind of developed a shared definition of what that was. And that was sort of how we worked with them. So I think it's a really important part of the reflexive approach to work that crosses these boundaries is to consider what capacities you do have, build some new ones, but the partnerships with folks who are experts in these various areas are just so crucial.
So one, I'll see if anybody else wants to ask a question, but okay, I'll get to you guys in just one sec. So one thing I think that was very interesting that came up in several of the presentations was kind of this thing about going in with quite a critical attitude to the people who are kind of in the trenches, but then realizing in practice, once you engage, that it's more complicated than it looks at first. In other words, that the people who are actually living these experiences have all sorts of understanding about there's a reason why they don't just do this, even though doing this looks like the simple solution. And I think Sarah put this in terms of a certain kind of humility was the word she used. But I think this is really, really important because often as kind of technical experts, if not technical like a technology, then you're technical in discourse analysis or whatever it is, we think that we know a lot about what's really going on, but very often we don't actually know about what's going on from the perspective of the people involved in these practices. And building change is rather difficult if you don't understand that perspective. Okay, so 2 people had their hands up. Oh, wow, now we're up to 3. I'm sorry, I kind of have to rush around because we've only got the one mic. Yeah.
My mask off so you can hear me. First, thanks for these projects. They're all really interesting, and I'm hoping that that you can help with a problem that I'm having in some of our work on coal transitions. And that's the fact that a lot of these sectors that we might be working with now that are really instrumental now are sectors that we're not going to necessarily need in the same way in the future. So in the case of EVs, we're in a lot of places we're looking to move away from private mobility or transport. Sorry, James, I'm going after your project, but long distance transportation. So we're trying to move away from a consumption-based society. So in the context of co-creating and building transdisciplinary solutions, do you have any ideas for how you go about that when the dominant actors who control things right now are actors that we're not going to need, or at least not in the same way in the future?
Thank you so much. I think we're getting to the essence of things. So
Thank you for 3 excellent presentations and having this open conversation about our role in let's say modern science. So thanks to all of you. So I have a few reflections that I'd like to share with you. I'd love to hear the views of the 3 speakers, but also of the room on these reflections on my experience with transdisciplinary work. First of all, indeed, it's highly political. So who do you engage with, right? So do you engage with the current powerful actors, or do you engage with those that need empowering in a vision towards truly sustainable societies? So if you start doing transdisciplinary work, you automatically become political, which isn't a bad thing, but it's good to be deliberate about that. Also, what I see if I study different transitions, and what you see happening is that there's huge attention to this innovation of new ways of doing things or using new technologies, There's not enough attention to deliberate decline, which requires different research, different governance, different groups of actors to actually stop doing some unsustainable stuff. So we also, as researchers, we go where the action is, because that's what we research, but we should also take into consideration that we should also research what's not happening, but should be happening. And so what does that mean in terms of our role as critical social scientists? 3 is, if we do it all sectorally, we miss out on some of the potential opportunities for accelerating societal transformations that go beyond these sectors. So these are changes in values, changes in our global economic system that you cannot, if you're stuck in a mobility or in a agro-food system transition, you miss out on these large societal changes that are also necessary to accelerate the transformation. So maybe we should find additional subsidies for Greta Thunberg. We may accelerate societal transformations more quickly than if we collaborate with people in a certain sector, right? So just teasing you a bit, but I actually mean it. And also, all of these transitions are related. So what we do or how we contribute to one transition actually has implications also for others. So the energy and the food, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we deal with James's question of how do we operate strategically also as a research community to not follow where the action is, but to actually be able to contribute where it matters most.
Okay, thanks. So there's quite a lot on the table. That's okay. So rather than taking more questions, I'll give the speakers a chance to give partial answers or to pick some of the bits of the issues that were done, and then we'll take a few more questions. And I'm told that we don't have like a hard and fast deadline. We absolutely have to be out of the room at 3:30 sharp. So we'll run over a couple of minutes in order to address some of these. So maybe I'll start with letting Sarah have an answer at any bit she wants to, and then the same for Katinka, and I'll come in last since I'm here.
Great. Such great points, and I won't be able to address them all, just a couple of things that jumped out at me. So the first question was talking a little bit about how do you work with partners or actors whose activities or sector or whatever is one that you would expect or even hope might decline into the future. And I think this brings to mind, the thing that I keep on hearing, which is so important, that 50 years from now, we don't want to have such a thing as a sustainable business or a green building. You want these concerns to be woven through every building, every business. And so that the distinction between them isn't so stark. And I think that some of the more transformative firms, at least that I've worked with, are reflecting on the extent to which their activities are something that are incompatible in their current form with a sustainable future. And so that means examining with them what path they might follow in the future. How did they shift? What did they move into, so that they are, don't continue to be part of the problem. So I think that's part of a really creative visioning process that can actually be really fruitful. I just want to offer one reflection on the observation that this is such a deeply political process we're engaging in. And so how do we choose who we're engaging with, those in power or those seeking power, or some combination of both? And just to offer one experience that we just had a few weeks ago, we hosted what we call the high-level sustainability summit, but it was sort of this learning community that we convened, some small businesses we had worked with and civil society partners we'd worked with for a long time, but some new faces as well. And we did this visioning exercise and various things, but we were deciding who should be in the room. And that list of folks, we just hashed that over and over and over, and it evolved many times over many months. And initially we wanted high level, heavy hitting elected officials so that we could sort of bring some power into the room and elevate this, the issue of sustainability transformations, the way we felt it needed to be. And then we started appreciating that elected officials, of course, are fairly transient. They come, they go. They may not have the deepest technical understanding of all of the issues, to put it kindly. And we also wanted to convene this at a time which in 3 days, in fact, it's municipal elections here in Ontario. So had we local politicians, which we wanted, they would be right in the midst of election season and not particularly willing to contradict themselves or show, insecurity or ask questions. And then if we had civil municipal staff alongside them, they couldn't contradict each other. So all this to say, I have worked with very well-intentioned sustainability, transdisciplinary sustainability scientists who think that if we put people together into a room, power dynamics like magically disappear. And that is terrifying to me. I think at the very least, we need to be incredibly careful and observant and open to understanding how power plays out in the rooms, among the people we're convening, because we are engaging in a political process. That's all.
Katinka, did you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I agree with a lot of what Sarah said, and I just wanted to add that I think because the two questions were actually both a little bit about unmaking, right? Like and abolishing, and I think we need pathways for that as well. So the engaging in these conversations can be an initial step, right? Like sometimes maybe they can turn into alternatives, and like businesses can transition towards a more social, ecological kind of program. But sometimes it might be more radical, right? Like indeed, like we need to stop this, but even then you need to come up with like, yeah, how does this happen? What's the pathway for this? And I do think that this is a challenge in thinking in sustainability transitions that's going to be more and more relevant in the next couple of years. And I do also really appreciate this sort of pushback on thinking only sectorally. I think like in the project that I talked about, it wasn't so much sectoral in the sense that these shoreline questions touch upon different sectors, right? Like it has to do with mobility for ferries, for example. It has to do with ecology. It had to do with like all these different kinds of things. So it's a different or alternative way to think about transitions is more place-based. But I really appreciate also this emphasis on thinking about culture and changing a mindset and changing a zeitgeist. And I think this is exactly why we need to be transdisciplinary in a way that's not just an add-on, but that's like really fundamental, where we have fundamental discussions about our ethical commitments, our political commitments, and how we make change happen. I'll leave it at that and give the floor to you, James.
Yes, so I'll just engage with a couple of the points because there were a lot. So making and unmaking, absolutely, you need to do both. One thing that I think is really important is that one of the things we see about transitions is the extent to which different sorts of factors and actors have to come together in order to generate effective processes of change. So the good news about that is that there are many ways for each of us to insert ourselves in the process. And it's hard for one individual or even a group of researchers to act at multiple levels. So we need people chaining themselves to factory gates or, blocking the entrance to parliament at certain times. We need smart lawyers tying, fossil fuel companies up in knots because they're violating existing pollutant statutes. So we need action at multiple levels, but we also need to try and leverage, if you like, gaps that there are within the power holders. So for instance, if we build up green industries, we will make people rich. I don't care if we make them rich, provided they're building and selling products and services that are helping displace those who are getting rich off existing environmentally and socially destructive practices. So I think we need action at multiple levels. I can't resist taking on this thing about EVs simply because you waved it in front of me, and I think it's really important. If you're thinking about sustainable mobility, there are many things to go. There's active transportation, the walking and biking. There's the development of mass transit. There's rebuilding cities so that they're more integrated with workplaces and where people live closer together. There's, Zoom, not traveling because we can use other tech. All of them important. But here I make a prediction. Okay, you can tell me I'm all wrong. In 20 years, there will be millions of personal automobiles and light-duty vehicles on the road in Canada. I don't know what it's going to be like in Utrecht city center, okay? But I do know that here we cannot, if you started rebuilding Toronto now, it cannot be rebuilt in a way that will be just served by walking and biking and mass transit in 20 years from now. So it's absolutely critical if we want to move forward that we electrify transport. But I don't want to lose sight of the other things you say, that we would love to have a society in which we don't need to displace ourselves with personally owned automobiles. But we have to be able to do both at once and simultaneously work. And it's the same with the sector thing. By sector, I'm really here thinking not of perhaps as government defines emissions reduction sectors or something. I'm thinking of systems. And of course, as we move, for instance, towards a net zero society, the boundaries of systems will change. So one thing it seems almost certain is we'll electrify more of society. So the boundaries between how energy flows will be transformed. So we need to do both at once. But one thing I would say that in the context here in Canada, the sector or system emphasis is a contrast to the whole of economy process. And much of the debate of climate change in the past here has been focused on, oh, we need to decarbonize the whole economy, we need carbon pricing, or we need, at a very abstract level of changing the whole economy, when that's not how economies change. Yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. But I agreed, of course, with many of the other points that were made. So there were a couple of more. We can keep going a bit if people, I think.
Thank you, Steffen from IDOS, German Institute of Development and Sustainability. And yeah, the systems will relate to each other and have repercussions, and it's all very political. I think we can take that for granted. Now, I would like to challenge you, James, on a concept that you, like in passing, mentioned at the very beginning of your talk, and that is the one about compelling drivers of change. So in a universe of actors and factors that do have an impact on these transitions, or even in preventing transitions from moving forward, how do we know, how do we identify those, the change agents that are actually compelling? And as a footnote to that, also taking account of the fact that we as a research community also like to, we flatter ourselves of being a prospective change agent ourselves. So how do you know the change agents when you see them?
Do either of you want to answer that, Sarah, or you're going to duck it? they're inviting me. So I don't think that there's obviously there's no magic answer to that. I think that you have to start with a kind of collaborative or engaged analysis of a system to understand its history and how it's developed and why it's ended up where it is, its strengths and its weaknesses, but not just from some abstract academic analysis, but by engaging with those who suffer its consequences or enjoy its profits or whatever. So I think that through that analysis, you can come to understand, and the different tools that you can draw from political economy and from a number of other strands of analysis in order to understand some of the dynamics in the system. I don't know how in an abstract sense to answer more than that, but if you want to talk about a particular system or a particular context, maybe that would make it more concrete. But anyone else is welcome to.
I would just jump in briefly, I guess, and just say that that question actually, who are the change agents and are they the ones we think they are, was one of the questions that triggered the development of Transform, because we, I had done quite a bit of work prior to that on on local city scale climate change action, and 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Is that right? 15 years ago, there was a lot of focus on sort of nation to nation negotiations on climate policy and the sort of big heavy hitting, and there still is, of course, on global goals and treaties and such. But the cities were kind of coming up and saying, wait a second, like we are where a lot of the action happens. We have, we have jurisdiction over a lot of the sources of emissions. We are where the impacts play out. We need a voice and an agency in that system. And it seemed to me that small businesses were sort of similar. We pay a lot of attention to the large corporate entities that, rightly so, are responsible for an enormous amount of emissions individually or whatever. But every economy is mostly made up actually of small businesses, and yet we do very little to coordinate them, to build capacity in them, to tackle sustainability, et cetera. So it seemed like an enormous opportunity, I guess, is a positive way to put it. To find where creative solutions were coming from. And, and it was also an interesting proxy for regular people, just like these are small businesses based in our own communities with really close community ties typically. And so understanding what they thought about climate change and how they're tackling it, if at all, was a really important sort of lens into the way society was shifting. So I think we need to be creative, use our intuition and our own life experience to hunt down where we think change is unfolding in exciting ways.
And I think staying in dialogue is crucial for that. In the example that I was talking about, the real bottleneck was permit reviewers, like the regulatory staff, whereas that was not necessarily part of a lot of the more academic analysis that I read. But as soon as you talk to people who are actually like trying to implement a nature-based solution or building a seawall, right? Like it's very evident, like who are the people in the sort of the practical world that are either enablers or barriers. So I think, just being a part of different worlds, not just part of the academic world, but being part of like practical worlds, of activist worlds, of social movements, etc., helps in sort of changing your view around these things and figuring out, okay, how do things happen or how do things not happen?
Yeah, I guess maybe just one other thing going back to that question. If we look historically at large-scale transitions, at a certain point, the state plays a critical role in actually scaling up and carrying them out. And you can think about almost any large-scale transition. And there are many reasons for that. One is, of course, his stakeholders, incumbents, and those who are try and get politicians and get legislative or fiscal support. But another one is that the state controls property rights. And most large scale transformations involve transformations of property rights in one way or another. Think about building railroads. You can't build railroads unless you can exert eminent domain and get the place to put them. Think about the arguments over copywriting GMOs or all these transformations involve at some point legal enforcement to change the relationships between and so the state is called to do that, which suggests that at a certain point politics becomes quite important. So the not just the transformation is always political, but the actual political mechanisms become important to push these transformations, which doesn't mean I'm saying change starts with the local elected representative, but at some point political processes become decisive. That's my old political science hat chatting. Okay, I don't see anyone else jumping up and down. So, and we have gone over our time. So thank you for being such, an engaged audience. And, I'm sure all of the speakers, so I thank all three of us. And we're all happy to discuss more about our projects or our work. And if you like something we said or think it's crazy, feel free to come and engage with us or fire off an email. We all believe in this stuff and we're happy to chat with you. So thank you very much.